This weekend of college football had it all. Close games, top 10 matchups, statement wins, and maybe even some Heisman moments. We're going to talk about it all, as well as giving you some of my dream matchups for bowl games and a definitive Heisman ranking. So, with the intro out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're going to be recapping Week 11 of college football. We're going to start by recapping the Michigan versus Penn State game. We're going to talk about 3 games before we get into the other stuff in this video. But the first game of that is Michigan at Penn State. This is not the way that I predicted this game to go in terms of mechanics and X's and O's, in terms of how the game was actually played. But in terms of the narratives, I nailed that right on the head, and I almost even perfectly predicted the score. I think I said 27-17 or something like that, or 28-17, something like that, with Michigan scoring a touchdown about halfway through the fourth quarter to kind of put the game away. And that's exactly what happened. I mean, that was the narrative of the game. It was a close game for 3.5 quarters. And then Michigan had that Blake Corum run after the failed fourth down conversion from Penn State on a tremendously bad play call. Nevertheless, Michigan ended up winning the game in a fairly convincing manner. Looking back at it, you can certainly make the case that Michigan really had control of that game from the time they scored their first touchdown to the end of the game. And it wasn't a dominant win in the sense of the word dominant, but it was a definitive win. I don't think saying Michigan dominated Penn State would be fair to either team. However, I do think Michigan thoroughly proves that they were the better football team. I mean, they didn't throw a pass for 2/3 of the game. They literally did not throw a pass from the halfway mark of the second quarter until the end of the game. And they basically just said, hey, Penn State, come beat us. And Penn State couldn't do it. They just flat out and straight up could not beat Michigan. And that leads to a interesting conversation surrounding the Penn State football program. And that's, what kind of program do you want to be? Are you going to be happy with 10-2? Maybe you get to 11 wins if you win the bowl game. Or do you want to win the Big Ten? Do you want to compete in the new Big Ten? And I don't know. I can't answer that. That's a question for Penn State fans. I can tell you that I was in a similar situation with Michigan for Jim Harbaugh's first 5 or 6 years or whatever it was, and I was completely not happy. I did not want Michigan to just be 10-2 and maybe you win the bowl game, maybe you don't, but I wanted them to compete for Big Ten championships. I wanted them to win the Big Ten. I wanted them to beat Ohio State. And they ended up doing that when they finally got their 5-star quarterback. But they also timed it very well. And that's, I think, the real problem with Penn State. In the past few years, whenever they've had their elite team, 2016, for example, and this year and last year as well, that was also when Michigan and Ohio State were having dominant years. Michigan timed it pretty well in 2021, where everybody in the conference was having a down year except for Michigan and Michigan State. So timing is a narrative here, and James Franklin just hasn't gotten it done. Now, I do think that this whole James Franklin is the most overrated coach in college football. Who thinks James Franklin is a top 10 coach in college football? Who thinks James Franklin is a top 15 coach in college football? Nobody. I think he's properly rated. I think everybody understands who James Franklin is. He's the guy, if you get him in a big-time Power 5 conference, he'll get you to 10 wins pretty much every year. That's who he is, and he'll struggle to get over the hump. And I don't particularly think that makes him overrated. I think he's properly rated. So I think the talks of firing James Franklin, of which there have been some, I don't particularly think anybody from Penn State has particularly perpetuated that conversation. But as far as the national media perspective, they're calling for James Franklin's head. I think that you could do a lot worse than James Franklin. Now, the question is, are you willing to risk becoming what you were after Joe Paterno for a 3 or 4 year stretch where you were basically irrelevant in order to potentially become what you were in like the 80s and 90s, where you were legitimately competing for conference and national titles every year. And for me, when I was a Michigan fan, I was calling for Jim Harbaugh's head after 2018. And I said, yo, I want him out. I can't handle this 10-2, 9-3, losing the bowl game kind of shit. I am perfectly willing to risk becoming what we were under Rich Rod and Brady Hoke in order to potentially be better than what we are now. I was willing to make that trade and take that risk potentially. So if you are, go ahead and let me know. And if you're not, tell me why. Maybe it's just because my personality, I'm a little bit more of a gambler and I expect excellence and all these sort of things. But if you're a Penn State fan, let me know how you feel. I am very much interested in how you feel about this. Let's go ahead and move on here to Ole Miss versus Georgia. And I didn't predict this game and this particular outcome. I thought Ole Miss would be able to keep it a little bit closer. But this game, specifically Ole Miss versus Georgia, has proven to me that Georgia is just on a different goddamn planet from everybody else in college football right now. I think there are probably only 2 or 3 teams that even have a modicum of a chance to defeat Georgia in a football game. We'll talk about that at the end of this video when we get to the power rankings, but Georgia is just on a different planet from everybody else, and it's not particularly because I think Georgia is this all-time great team. I don't think they are this year. I don't think there is one, and I just don't think anybody else is even a great team. I think we have 7 to 10 really good teams and 1 great team in college football this year, and that's Georgia and everybody else. So I don't know who's going to win the national championship. I don't know who's going to win Georgia versus Alabama. That got confirmed to be the SEC championship game this week, so I don't know how that game is going to go. I haven't really looked up into the matchups quite yet, but my gut instinct just tells me Georgia is on a different planet from everybody else, so they're going to win that game. And for Ole Miss, as far as you guys go, I think there's a real possibility that you end up 10-2, which is good, and you have a New Year's Six bowl game matchup, which is also good. But sort of like with Penn State in this previous section, when do you start to have conversations about Lane Kiffin and what you want to be as a program? Are you perfectly content going 10-2 every year, losing to Georgia and Alabama? Or do you want to have the kind of team that can win and compete in the SEC championship game? And if that is the case, I don't think Lane Kiffin is your guy. I think Lane Kiffin and James Franklin are very similar coaches. Not in the sense that like Lane Kiffin calls plays and James Franklin doesn't, but in terms of tiers that they're in college football, I think they're both somewhere between 15 and 20. I don't think they're anywhere near the elite category. However, I don't think they're bad either. And I think the conversation surrounding them being overrated is completely moronic because I don't think anybody thinks they're elite football coaches, and they are good football coaches, so I don't understand how they can be overrated. Now, Lane Kiffin is also much earlier on in his tenure at Ole Miss than James Franklin is at Penn State. So maybe right now you're like, oh, we're still kind of building up to that level to be able to be that national championship, SEC championship contending sort of team. And maybe you hope that Lane Kiffin can turn into a Dabo Swinney or a Jim Harbaugh, where sort of in year 6, 7, 8, they kind of finally managed to get over the hump and win the title and get to the playoffs. However, maybe your sights are set a little bit higher. And if that is the case, I think banking off of the fact that Clemson and Michigan sort of had this year 6, 7, 8 explosion to becoming a national powerhouse, I'm not sure that's a very good or realistic idea. So maybe you have to move on from Lane Kiffin if that is your actual goal. Now, unlike with Penn State, if I was an Ole Miss fan, I would be perfectly fine going 10-2 every year. Because the fact of the matter is if you go back through Ole Miss's history, there was never a period of time where they were consistently competing for championships. Well, I mean, like, if you want to go back to the late 50s, early 60s, where they won like 3 national championships in 5 years and like 6 SEC championships, then, like, fine. I don't give a shit. But that is not a legitimate case. That's like Michigan claiming all of their 15 national titles before the year 1930. Like, those don't count. Nobody thinks those count. And I don't think anything before 1970 particularly counts in college football, okay? But that's just me. And you can have your opinions. You can say, oh, if we can get back to like what we were in the 60s, I don't care. You can believe that if you want to. But if I was an Ole Miss fan, I would be perfectly fine with going 10-2 every year and just sort of being the Penn State of the SEC. Now, whether or not you can continue to do that with Oklahoma and Texas entering the conference is another little wrinkle in this discussion, but I do think they are a good football team. I do think Lane Kiffin is a good football coach, and I do think you do have the resources available to you to be able to consistently play at a high level. Last game that we're going to talk about here, Utah versus Washington. And when it comes to the way that I predicted this game and how it would go, I didn't particularly hit it on the head, but I got Washington pretty dead right on the offensive side of the football. I said Utah has a really good but not great and not elite defense, and Washington's going to be able to move the ball and they're going to be able to score. So I predicted them to get 31 points. They ended up getting 35. So I am going to take kind of a victory lap on that. However, I did not think Barnes, the quarterback for Utah, had that in him. I didn't think he had that level of play in him because he played really well. And he was running around and scrambling and picking up first downs. And geez, man, I didn't think he was that kind of an athlete. I've seen Utah games. Like, I knew he could move around a little bit, but he was actually running the football in this game. So I didn't think he had that in him. It turns out he does. So that's really good. And I think it's very likely that Cam Rising is going to transfer to a different program after this year. And with Barnes, I think you're still sitting pretty to have a decent chance at competing in the Big 12 next year. So I wouldn't be too concerned about Cam Rising potentially leaving, but Cam Rising I do think is a better quarterback than Barnes this year. And if he had managed to stay healthy in the Rose Bowl game, and the injury was just devastating, just absolutely destroyed his knee. But if he had managed to stay healthy, I think Utah would have had a much better chance at winning not just this game, but also against Oregon and Oregon State. So I think Utah could potentially legitimately have been in a situation where they could have competed for 3 straight Pac-12 titles had Cam Rising been healthy. And Washington, as far as Washington goes, I said in the video that Utah was not going to be your toughest matchup, and I still agree with that. I think Oregon State is your toughest matchup, and that's coming up this week. We'll talk about that matchup in the video on Friday, but I think this game and how you won, the fact that it was closer than I thought it would be and closer than I think a lot of people thought it would be, and you managed to still hold on and you made the plays when you needed to make the plays. I'm not going to talk about number 11 dropping the ball before he scored a touchdown, but you made the plays when you needed to make the plays offensively and defensively. So that to me is a very good sign and a good omen that you have a real chance to win out and make the playoffs again. And as we'll discuss just a little bit from now, if that is the case, I think Michael Penix probably wins the Heisman Trophy. Moving on here to my next segment here, I'm going to talk about all of my dream bowl game matchups at this point. I'm not going to talk about teams that I think have a real chance of making the playoffs, so you're not really going to see any of them in this area here, but this is all of the games and the bowl game potential matchups that I would be most interested in seeing. And I'm going to start off with Ole Miss versus Penn State. And this game is what I am dubbing the Kiffin-Franklin paradox. Basically, you take two coaches that can't win big games and you put them against each other and see who wins. Now, there are no ties in college football. Otherwise, that would likely be the outcome. But that is a dream matchup for me just so that I can figure out which one of those coaches is just slightly better than the other one. The next one on the list is Liberty versus James Madison. I understand perfectly that James Madison is not eligible for bowl games. They should be, but they aren't. because of the fact that they're jumping into Division One this year as opposed to the FCS. So I just think James Madison is really good, and I think Liberty is also really good with similar sort of teams and two coaches that I think are likely to be considered options for mid-level, lower-end Power 5 jobs in the near future. The next two games are probably my favorite because they're absolute inverses of each other. LSU versus USC, I think we would see both of those teams score in the 70s. I think it'd be like 28-21 at the end of the first quarter. All offense, nothing else. Neither of these teams have anything else other than offense. And it would be absolutely glorious to see this matchup. And UCLA versus Iowa, that's the exact inverse of that. They both have inept offenses and maybe even elite caliber defenses. So I would love to see that matchup, to have a 7-10 game, hopefully right before or right after a 70-71 game in LSU versus USC. So that's just total inverses of each other, and I think they would both be a lot of fun. This next one, I think, is probably the most realistic matchup, and that's Missouri versus Tulane, likely in like the Peach Bowl or something like that. And this is a game that for Tulane, I think would sort of solidify themselves as like, oh yeah, this is a real football team and a real football program on a national level, not just a group of 5 level, but on like a national level. And for Missouri, with Elijah Dinkowitz and all of them, I think this would be a good chance for them to say, hey, we won a New Year's Six bowl game. Let's get some guys and let's try to win the SEC. I mean, you were the only team that's given Georgia even anything remotely close to a scare so far this year. So that is a really, really big accomplishment in my opinion. And I think you are one of the 10 best teams in college football. So having a chance to play against a group of 5 opponent to win a bowl game, a New Year's Six bowl game, would be a dream scenario for Missouri. And for Tulane, you can sort of have a transitive property if you end up beating Missouri by a touchdown or so and just be like, hey, we're on the same level as Georgia. That could be the narrative that you want to say, kind of like UCF when they won the national championship, when they beat the team that beat the national championship in that bowl game. So I don't know exactly if this matchup is going to happen, but I do think it's fairly realistic, probably like the Peach Bowl or something like that. Last two matchups here, Utah versus Tennessee and Louisville versus Oklahoma. I just think from a schematic perspective, this would be a very interesting game. Utah and Tennessee are almost built exactly the same this year. They both don't really ask their quarterbacks to do a whole lot. They both kind of struggle throwing the football but have really good run games, and they both have good, not great defenses. For Louisville versus Oklahoma, I think that is also another X's and O's matchups that I find particularly interesting. Louisville and Oklahoma both seem to be the same, but like opposite of each other. Louisville is very explosive on offense, as is Oklahoma. However, Oklahoma gets their explosion from the passing game, and then with the running game, they're kind of like, 3-4 yards, we're going to move the ball down the field. And Louisville gets all of their explosion from the running game, and with the passing game, it's like, we're going to dink and dunk it, and 6-7 yards a chunk everywhere down the field. So they both have defenses that have exceeded expectations, but are not unbeatable or unmatch up againstable. I think they're solid, not good. So I think this would be a relatively high scoring matchup. And I think it's two very close, very similar sort of teams. And I really like this matchup. Next thing on the docket, I'm going to give you my Heisman rankings. Now, I want to make this very clear. This is not who I think the best players in college football is. I'm not dumb enough to just make my Heisman be like, these are the best players in college football. No, I think that these are the 6 players that have the narratives, the talent, and the opportunity to win the Heisman Trophy. I don't particularly think anybody else has the chance to win this award. I think there's one dark horse guy, and that's the Louisville running back whose name I can't think of. If they were to upset Florida State, he rushes for like 250 yards and 3-4 touchdowns. But that's the only scenario that I think there is somebody who can sort of get in this conversation. I think everybody else is on the outside looking in. At number 1, I have Marvin Harrison Jr. If he has 10 catches, 150 yards, 2 touchdowns against Michigan, and Ohio State wins, you can give him the award because he is their offense. They don't have really anything else outside of explosive runs in the run game from Travion Henderson. They don't have anything else. And Marvin Harrison is the best wide receiver I've ever seen, and he is an absolute unstoppable force. At number 2, I have Jaden Daniels, and this one is just because he has been the best player in college football so far this year. He's not going to win the Heisman. He might get invited to the ceremony. He might not, but he's not going to win the Heisman, and he'll probably end up being the guy with the second most votes because everyone will be like, oh, yeah, I'll put him at 3 because he's clearly been the best player in college football this year, but he can't win the award because his team doesn't win. So I don't know why, but if Jaden Daniels deserves the Heisman Trophy, even if LSU is 9-3 at the end of the season, he's been the best player in college football this year, in my opinion. At number 3, I have Michael Penix Jr., and if Washington ends up winning out, I think there's a very real possibility he kind of wins the award by default because he's a quarterback and not a wide receiver. And I think that's the most realistic scenario of anybody so far this year. And that's Michael Penix winning out. They managed to beat Oregon in the rematch again. And he has a really good game like he did the first time. He kind of puts the Heisman Trophy discussion on ice, and it's like, oh, yeah, it's mine. I won it this year. And everything I just said about Michael Penix Jr., you can go ahead and just copy and paste it onto Bo Nix if he wins the rematch in the Pac-12 championship game, which is very likely in my opinion. So Bo Nix, I do think, probably has a better chance of winning the matchup, but if he doesn't throw for like 350 and 4 or 5 touchdowns and like have a Heisman moment in that game, then I think Michael Penix would still probably finish above him in the award because Michael Penix does so far have a Heisman Trophy, and that was that game-winning pass to get them down into field goal range against Oregon, and Bo Nix doesn't have that so far this year. Doesn't mean that he can't get one, but right now he doesn't have one. Carson Beck at 5. This is one that nobody's talking about. Carson Beck is playing like a first-round draft pick at the quarterback position. He has been phenomenal. Since the second half of the Auburn game, he has been a top 5 quarterback in college football. And yes, he has talent around him. Yes, he has the best offensive line in the country. Yes, he has a really, really good run game. Yes, he has 6 or 7 draftable wide receivers and tight ends that he's throwing to. I get all of that. So does everybody else. So does Jaden Daniels. So does J.J. McCarthy. So does Bo Nix, Michael Penix. Everybody has wide receivers and tight ends to throw the football. If you don't, then you're not putting up numbers. So that's not a legitimate complaint against him to be like lodged against him being in the Heisman Trophy discussion, okay? And at number 6, I have J.J. McCarthy. And J.J. McCarthy's Heisman opportunity, I think, sailed this past week at Penn State because he only threw 8 passes for 60 yards. And he did run the ball a little bit, but he didn't run the ball enough for him to win this game. It would take him going something like 20 for 25 and like 400 yards and 5 touchdowns against Ohio State for him to win the award, and I don't see any scenario where that happens. I don't particularly think he has any sort of realistic chance to win the Heisman Trophy. But I've put him on here on the list at number 6 because there would be a lot of people that would bitch about it if I didn't. Moving on, I don't have the energy to do a top 25 this week, so we're just going to do a top 15. At number 15, I have Tulane, who has moved up 3 spots. At number 14, I have Ole Miss, who's moved down 5 spots. At number 13, I have Oklahoma, who shot up 4 spots. At number 12, I have Oregon State, who shot up 4 spots. At number 11, I have Penn State, who's down 1 spot. So sticking here with Penn State, my opinion on Penn State as a football team hasn't changed a whole lot. I still think they're an elite caliber defense, maybe the best defense in college football, and they are offensively challenged. And I think the offensive challenges stem not so much from the quarterback position, as some people are going to say, but from a play calling and game planning perspective, because they do not let Drew Allard do what he is really good at doing. They just refuse to let him throw the ball deep, and they just refuse to let him throw the ball over the middle of the field. All of the plays where he's missing are stuff like crossing routes and out routes where he's throwing it behind the receiver. And those are the most difficult throws in football. And yes, he has the arm talent to make those throws, but why are you asking him to do it whenever you have run a little like dig concept over the middle or something like that? He nails it every single time. And whenever you throw the deep ball, he's proven to be really good at that. So I don't understand the thought process behind Penn State just refusing to let Drew Allard do the stuff that he's good at doing. And if they do let him do the stuff that he's good at doing, then I think they'd be 12-0. I think they would have a very serious chance at going 12-0. But they don't do what he's good at. I don't understand how it makes any sense. And that is on James Franklin and the offensive coordinator, whoever's calling plays, because I don't believe James Franklin calls plays. At 12, we've got Oregon State, and I really, really like this team. I think they have a real chance to beat Washington and a real chance to beat Oregon in their final 2 games this year. I don't think they get both, and I haven't particularly looked at the micro of an Oregon State versus Washington matchup, but I do think it favors Oregon State quite a bit. And that early season loss to Washington State is really biting them in the ass. If they don't lose that game, they're ranked in the top 10 right now, and they have a real chance of making the playoffs, not just the Pac-12 championship game. At number 13, Oklahoma, survive and advance. You control your own destiny even after losing the last Bedlam game. If you win out, you're in the Big 12 championship game, and you'll have a rematch against Texas with a real chance to win that football game again. At 14, Ole Miss, you just got to handle business these last 2 weeks here. Get to 10 wins. You'll have a real good chance at a New Year's Six bowl game. And Tulane, it's the same sort of deal. Win out. Win your conference. Nobody cares that you've only been beating teams by 2 or 3 points these past few weeks. Nobody cares about that. What they care about is your final record. And if you're 12-1, you're going to be ranked the highest Group of 5 champion, and you're going to have a chance for back-to-back New Year's Six bowl game wins. Moving on to 10 through 6. At number 10, I have Missouri, who moves up 2 spots after beating Tennessee. At number 9, I have Louisville, who's up 2 spots after winning on Thursday night. At number 8, I have Texas moving down 1 spot. At number 7, I have Oregon moving down 1 spot, because Alabama, continuing to dominate these past few weeks, I think has jumped both of them in a ranking sort of situation. Moving back to the top here, number 10, Missouri. I really like this team. I think if they had somehow managed to survive and beat LSU, then I think they would have a real, legitimate chance to make the playoffs, even as an 11-1 team. I believe that in my heart of hearts. Now, this year there are so many good teams, I don't think they would make the playoffs as an 11-1 team, but there would be people being like, yo, how is Missouri not one of the 4 best teams? Their only loss is to a 2-time defending national champion who just won the SEC. So there would be some legitimate gripes if Missouri were to miss the playoffs had they been able to beat LSU, but they weren't able to beat LSU. Either way, this is still a phenomenal season for Missouri. Just got to handle business, win the last 2 games of the season. Louisville, it's the same thing. You win this week, you're in the ACC championship game. Nobody cares if you beat Kentucky or not. You have a good showing against Florida State, and you're a real football team with a real football coach and a real football program. I love Jeff Brom. He's the front runner and might run away with Coach of the Year for me. Texas at 8. I've decided to move you down even though you beat Alabama, because you have not looked like the same football team since that game. And Alabama is not the same football team that lost to you. Jalen Milroe has gotten so much better since that game. So right now, I'm moving you down a little bit. However, win out, everything else will take care of itself. The only scenario where you don't make the playoffs if you win out is if Florida State, Michigan, or Ohio State, and also Washington wins out. Because I don't think Oregon has the same resume that you do, and I think you would get in over Oregon, who I have at number 7. However, if Oregon manages to win out, Texas manages to falter, then I think there's a very real possibility Oregon makes the playoff as a 12-1 team as the 4 seed. When it comes to Alabama, I think that this, and we'll discuss this in the power rankings that are coming up after this, but I think Alabama is one of 3 teams that stands a punching chance or a puncher's chance to beat Georgia. And because of that, I've got them ranked number 6, ahead of Texas and Oregon. And my top 5 rankings remain unchanged. I have Washington at 5, Florida State at 4, Ohio State at 3, Michigan at 2, and Georgia at 1. I don't particularly think there's much of a case to put this any differently. I think if Washington beats Oregon State, I think they might jump Florida State to end up being my number 4 team next week. But that's probably the only scenario where I see this changing. Ohio State will handle Minnesota. Michigan will likely handle Maryland. Georgia has 2 not very difficult games, in my opinion, to round out their schedule. Now, moving on to the stuff that actually matters, power rankings. So these are not even necessarily who would win in a matchup against another team. This is just straight up who I believe is the best team in the country, etc., overall. Not necessarily who would win in a matchup. So at number 10, I have Missouri. They are likely to remain at number 10 for the remainder of the season, assuming they don't falter in the last 2 weeks of the season. I have Texas at 9. They just have to survive at this point. Michigan at 8, moving down 1. Washington at 7, moving down 1. Florida State at 6, moving down 1. I think that this is a really close group of 3 teams right here. However, I don't think any of them have a particularly good chance of matching up well against or beating Georgia, so they are ranked lower than the teams that I think do have a decent chance at beating Georgia. And those teams are at number 5, Alabama, moving up 3 spots. At number 4, Ohio State, staying the same. And at number 3, Oregon, staying the same. There is no number 2, and Georgia is number 1, because Georgia, as I've already said several times in this video, is on a different goddamn planet than everybody else in college football. However, I do think these 3 teams have at least a chance to beat Georgia. I think everybody below them straight up does not. I don't think Michigan can beat Georgia. I don't think Washington can beat Georgia. And I don't think Florida State can beat Georgia. I think Alabama has a decent chance. I think Ohio State would have a decent chance. I think Oregon would have maybe the closest chance of beating everybody, which is why I have them at 3. Also, when it comes down to it, Oregon, transcendent quarterback play. Ohio State, transcendent wide receiver play. Alabama, maybe the best all-around roster in the country outside of Georgia. So this is the 3 teams that I think has a real chance of beating Georgia. Everybody else, I think it's like less than 10%. But that's just me. And what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. So at this point, I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with me at any point in the video, or if you just have something to say, go ahead and leave a comment down in the comment section below. And with that all said, I'll see you next time.